Okay, so this is the brief audio review for Chapter 4, Research Designs. It depends on the question. So, in the research process, the initial steps that you have, you're going to need to have an overall plan of a study for collecting data, right? So, it's important to put a lot of thought into the research design and methodological approach because this will set up what can be examined in your research. So, first, you need to make sure it addresses a research question. This is the essential one. Your method of data collection needs to be one that can address the questions that you bring up in your research. So if you're asking how many students face homelessness at Cal State Fullerton, you need to pick a design that would ask Cal State Fullerton students, such as a survey, right, that could find out a relevant answer to that question. So really it depends on the nature of the question. Which approach you pick just has to do with what you're thinking of looking at. So if it's a small scale or large scale scope, that's going to affect the kind of data you collect and how you collect that data. So selecting a research topic is a very important step. How does one do this? Well, there's no right or wrong way. That you have to just think about what topic areas in the social sciences that you are the most interested in. What makes you curious? Do you have some personal experiences that give you an insight into a particular population, maybe one that's understudied? Such as doing research on the foster care system after aging out of it yourself. So you still have to do the research and know the general literature, but your specific knowledge can help you better understand these issues. So experienced researchers select topics that are intrinsic to their discipline, that are suggested by ongoing research and theory, and are usually ones of strong personal interest to them. So they talk about how research studies examined in the chapter were motivated by the interests and specialties of the researchers who conducted them. So what should novice researchers do? Same deal. First and foremost, choose something that is of a strong personal interest to you. As you're going to spend a lot of time working on it, you want it to be something that's interesting. Then you got to conduct the literature review. So what's the purpose of that? Why do a literature review? Well, it's going to help you identify researchable questions related to your research topic. So you need to provide the information to back up your analysis of your research question. So for example, if you were doing research on children and exposure to technology, you would need to provide studies that argue for and against exposure and look at the ways your question could be explained with the data and findings of previous research studies. So the lit review also establishes a connection to research and theory. So by understanding the research that came before it, a researcher can position their research in the context in order to add to the overall body of information and, of course, limit any sort of bias they might have about the topic. And of course, the literature review also provides information about how previous studies have been conducted. This can help when you're thinking about what kind of methods a study would have. You can see how previous researchers studied or measured or observed phenomena that you're interested in studying. So the book goes through these guidelines for literature searches, and it has kind of like a whole list of them. So I'll go through them real brief. So first you want to start the search with the library's online resources. There are many peer-reviewed journals that are free of charge to you through the library database. So you want to start there. So you want to conduct a keyword search of the library's electronic database. The CSUF Pollock Library has just revamped their website recently, so it's now much more user-friendly than the previous version was. So this one is much like a Google search, where it will give you related information, and it's not as limiting as the previous database searches, so that's good. Then you're going to view the initial results with the aim of narrowing your topic. So you might have an idea of what research you're looking for, but ultimately, you're limited by what research actually exists out there to use. If you see that certain topics or issues you wanted to address are difficult to find in the literature, this can be a chance to change the scope of your research to better fit your research to the existing paradigms of knowledge. Then you want to locate relevant references by reading titles and abstracts. What I do is look at the abstract because it gives you a snapshot of the overall research and can give you an idea if the research is relevant to what you're examining in your research. So it's a good place to start in order to determine if an article will be helpful to you. And then you want to read the most recent literature first and work backwards. So you want more recent scholarship on a topic whenever possible, as some previous research may rely on older schools of thought or later debunked hypotheses that have fallen out of date or just no longer relevant. So this, of course, depends on what kind of topic you're looking at, of course, but you want to focus on the newer ones first and then move your way backward chronologically through the research. Then you want to search for review articles that summarize literature on a topic. So some articles do a good job of compiling arguments from certain paradigms or summarizing major theories or perspectives, which can really help you develop the theoretical underpinnings of what you're trying to examine in your research. And the book talks about how you should use the internet sparingly and selectively. So there's a lot of information on the internet, which can be a good thing, especially for someone writing a literature review. But there's a lot of noise out there, which is crap, because it's unverifiable or often misleading. So I used to encourage students to use Google Scholar, as the CUSF library database wasn't so great, but the updated version's pretty easy. And so I'm going to record a brief explainer about how to use the library resources and show you that the library does also have some videos specifically showing you how to use their site, and a little brief review of Google Scholar and some of the good things that can come out of that. So look for that on Titanium. All right, so when it comes to formulating a research question, what makes it a good question? Well, first it has to be something interesting, right? It contributes to ongoing research and theory. So more than just being something you're interested in, it should be something that contributes to ongoing research and theory. So interesting to the paradigm. It should be focused. So by being specific and concrete, your research question can clearly explore and examine factors related to your research with a clear focused tone. And it should be manageable, so feasible in terms of time and other resources. You don't want it to, take too much time to do or ask too much, because that makes it very hard to answer. So you want it to be focused, but not too specifically focused that you can't find any applicable peer review research sources. So it's really finding that balance. So when you're preparing your research designs themselves indicate the kind of data you're going to gather and how you're going to gather and interpret them. So the options for gathering data really depends on the type of research question that you have. So if you're asking a quantitative research question, those typically ask about relationships between variables, meaning, is there a relationship between X and Y when you control for other factors? In this kind of research, the variables need to be clearly defined before the researcher gathers the data. While in qualitative research questions, these are questions that ask about social processes and meanings and cultural significance of phenomena. And they ask what patterns or relationships exist in people's lives, focusing on the social processes that produce those patterns. So when you're looking at design considerations for quantitative questions, social scientists are usually looking at the social world and attempting to understand their quantitative research questions. They're looking at the social world as operating with certain laws or assumptions about how things work. So they typically use a deductive approach in their research so they can test their hypothesis about a relationship between specific variables. The goal of which is to identify causal relationships that can say that one variable, your independent variable, is causing an effect in your dependent variable. You also want to identify general patterns by examining data across many cases and determine whether a relationship exists that can be expressed in numerical data. So as far as research strategies for quantitative research, there's certain strategies that generally address quantitative questions, such as experiments, surveys, and of course some forms of existing data analysis. And your book kind of goes into how these things work, but we're going to be going into these much more in detail in the future lectures. So a part of the focus in quantitative research is the unit of analysis. So the unit of analysis are just the cases or entities that researchers study. So they're the things that you describe and compare, right? So if you were looking at individual people or families, or maybe a comparison between nations, looking at existing data like books or a content analysis of TV programs, right? That would be your unit of analysis. And so, Your method of selecting your unit depends again on your question and on your research strategy. So in survey research, something you're going to have to look at a lot in this class, units are usually chosen randomly from a specified population. When it comes to variables in quantitative research, we have to first ask, what is a variable? A variable, like a textbook it talks about, is a concept that varies over cases over time within a given case. So the book gives different demographics as examples, such as, how people differ in age, sex, grade level, such as being a freshman, a sophomore, a junior, senior, your income, etc. So there's different types of variables. There are many of them, but the most important ones in research are the independent and dependent variables. So the dependent variable is the outcome that is to be explained, while the independent variable is the presumed cause of change in the dependent variable. So we're going to go through various examples of this from the research in the book. While an extraneous variable is not a part of the hypothesized relationship, but may be another variable involved. There's certain kinds of extraneous variables. So there's antecedent and intervening variables, which again, we'll talk about and I'll give you examples from the book. So antecedent variables are ones who occur prior in time to both the independent and dependent variable, while intervening variables are those that are both an effect of the independent variable and a cause of the dependent variable. So intervening meaning it's between those two. Also, as far as extraneous variables, there are controlled and uncontrolled variables. So variables can be either controlled or uncontrolled. Control variables are just held constant, which means that they do not change during the course of analysis or observation. So the book talks about Broh's research, which controlled for numerous extraneous variables like income, race, sex, school size. So this means she could test the influence of those variables on the relationship between sports participation and academic achievement, which were her independent and dependent variables. So this is one of the figures from your book. So one way that Broh decided to measure her variable of academic achievement was through looking at the grades of these particular students in their English class. So in this figure, you see some of her data based on this one variable, with student 1 who got a C, student 2 who got a B, student 3 who got an A, and student 4 who also got an A. So remember, the dependent variable is the one that the researcher is interested in explaining, and it's the variable we assume as being influenced by another or independent variable. So Broh's hypothesis was that sports participation is a positive enhancement on academic achievement. So in Broh's case, the independent variable she's looking at is participation in sports as causing a change in the dependent variable, which she has as grades within an English course. So in this figure, there's the independent and dependent variables compared to each other using individual cases of data, those same 4 from the previous example. Now, remember, whenever we're looking at relationships between variables, we have to be careful to make sure that we're not measuring the wrong variables, or maybe that the relationship we see between the independent and dependent variables may have to do with extraneous variables, antecedent variables, or intervening variables. So in this figure, there are examples of these variables that may complicate the researcher's findings. So an antecedent variable, which again means a variable that occurs before and may be the cause of the independent and dependent variables in a causal relationship. So parents' income can be an antecedent variable in Broh's research, as it relates to both the independent variable of participation in sports, as those things take money, and the dependent variable, academic achievement, which again, money comes with tutors and other academic privileges that may enhance academic achievement. Also in the figure is a potential intervening variable, which remember, is a variable that comes between the independent and dependent variable in a causal relationship. So it's the effect of one and the cause of the other. So in Broh's research, the potential intervening variable, which is social capital, or the benefits and privileges that can come from social connections and networks, So in this case, the connections that come from sports participation give a student social capital, which can then positively affect their academic achievement. So when inferring causal relationships in quantitative research, what kinds of evidence are really needed to infer causality? Well, it's very hard to prove that one thing is definitively caused by another. So we may see relationships between any number of variables, but can we really prove that one is causing the other and not just related in some way? Well, researchers generally agree at least 3 kinds of evidence are needed to establish causality. The first being association, then direction of influence, and non-spuriousness. So association are just changes in one variable accompanied by a systematic change in another. So tests of statistical significance determine whether an association could have occurred by chance, right? And so the statistics themselves, or what they call correlation coefficients, something we'll talk about later, measure the degree of association. And of course, there's the direction of influence. So which variable in an association influences and changes the other? So usually this is determined in what they call a temporal order, or just what means in the order of when they occurred. So the book gives the example of how your age is a characteristic that comes before your political party affiliation, because none of us drop out of the womb with like real strong political biases, or like I kind of hope we don't. So this really makes the timing of observations an important element of the research design. So going back to Broh's example, it's important if the students' test scores improved after they joined sports, or if their good grades were what made them more likely to participate in sports, right? So what happened first is important. So this figure from your book is from a study that's looking to examine the relationship between a person's race and the 2012 presidential vote choice. So meaning that the unit of analysis are the individual respondents, so in this case, voters. So this table provides answers for 4 hypothetical respondents. And the data fit a very consistent pattern. So if the race changes from white to black, the other variable changes from Romney to Obama. In real life, we rarely see such clear relationships, and this is why statistics is used to measure associations between 2 variables, so we can see how valid these relationships are. So continuing with the 2012 presidential vote choice by race example, this table shows 21,985 respondents and their racial identities, and if they voted for Obama and Romney. So side note, there were other people running that year. I know we have a dominant 2-party system, but they excluded votes for other candidates. Also, we like to talk about race in America as a white-black dichotomy, but of course there are many other racial and ethnic groups. So those people's votes have also been excluded from this data. So unlike the previous table that related whites as only voting for Romney and blacks as only voting for Obama, we can see here that different percentages of voters cast their ballots for these 2. So you have 40% of white voters and 93.5% of black voters casting their ballot for Obama, and 60% of white voters and 6.5% of black voters casting their ballot for Romney. So when you look at the difference in voting for Obama between white and black respondents, it's a 53.5% difference, which is, what is called in stats a percentage difference. And the way it works is that the larger the percentage difference, the more likelihood there is an association between those variables. So in these cases, you use a test of statistical significance to say if the percentage is high, that it's probably not a random outcome, but may reflect some of those interesting differences. So when it comes to inferring causal relationships in quantitative research, again, what kind of evidence is needed to infer causality? Well, we talked about association and direction of influence, but the third one is called non-spuriousness. So non-spuriousness is just asking, is there a common cause of association between variables? So spurious associations are those that can result from common antecedent variables. So, the one I like to give as an example is that if you put these 2 variables together into a lot of SPSS data, you would find a strong relationship between the 2 variables, the first being height and the second being intelligence. So it would assume, because of the correlation, that the taller you are, the smarter you are. So as a person that's 5'10", I'm cool with that, right? But of course, that's too simple a relationship. When you factor in the fact that there might be a spurious relationship because there's an intervening variable of some kind, right? So in this case, the intervening variable is age, right? As your height is related to your age, but also your intelligence is related to your age. So of course there's going to be some relationship there, but it's really them both having a relationship with age, right? So anyway, establishing non-spurious relationships makes controlling for extraneous variables an important element in research designs. So specifying intervening variables strengthens inferences about non-spuriousness and causality. So this just means that as the researcher, you're saying, here are other potential variables. I am aware of them. I can show that they're not influencing the relationship between these variables and what I'm measuring, which again gives a lot more strength and credibility to your inferences. So an example of a spurious association from your book is two things that could be related, right? The number of storks, the number of births, but obviously the intervening variable is something else. It's not as if the more storks there are, the more babies that are born, because storks are bringing babies. It's really the population is related to both the number of storks and the number of people, right? So when it comes to design considerations for qualitative questions, qualitative research often takes a very different approach than quantitative research. So to try and understand human behaviors, researchers need to take people's points of view into consideration. So qualitative questions ask about the meaning and purpose of human actions for groups and individuals. They also want to understand the processes and interactions that people experience that produce patterns in society. So they seek to produce theory and understand the people by getting in-depth knowledge of their lives. So we will go through the steps outlined here a bit more in depth. So, which strategies generally address qualitative research questions? Well, there's others, but field research, in-depth interviews, and some forms of existing data analysis all get to those meanings and patterns of individuals. So when it comes to selecting cases in qualitative research, you generally want to select a single setting or a small number of cases. And this is so researchers can understand the meanings of the people and actions in a given context. So of course it should fit your research question. This makes sense. So if you were studying participants in an educational institution, then you would likely pick your setting as the school itself. So this also may depend on the ability to gain access. This is important, to getting the perspectives and insights of participants. You need a way to get in with them so they accept you and feel comfortable enough that, to gain access, that they're going to actually talk to you about how they feel. So sometimes you can gain this access by being a member of the group or a previous member of the group, which will kind of give you an insider view of that world. So based on how much cases will enhance theoretical understanding, this is also how people select. So people are selected for the research in order to have a better understanding of meanings and processes in their lives, or the part of their lives that's being examined. So when it comes to data collection and analysis in qualitative research, this usually follows the inductive logic of inquiry, right? Where you collect data, then you examine the data and look for patterns in order to understand the meanings. And then you use theory, of course, to make sense of these findings. So research questions may change once the data collection begins. So data usually is gathered from different sources, such as observations, interviews, and really, this is the strength of qualitative research, that it can adapt to what's being found. So for example, one of my mentors did research on expatriates of the US who live in the Philippines, who have sex with other men, and this kind of sex work relationship there. So using the theory or concept of Orientalism to understand the way that white Westerners were exoticizing having sex with these racial others in other countries. But when she started collecting the data, she realized that the Filipino men who were having sex and often financial relationships with these men, most of them did not see themselves as sex workers, right? They saw themselves as tour guides with a bonus, right? So she had to reconceptualize her approach based on this new information. so that she could better understand the participants of her research, right? So sometimes it changes once you're collecting the data, you learn stuff and you change your approach. So empirical patterns and theory emerge during data collection. As you're doing the research, you tend to start seeing the patterns show up, and you start kind of looking at different theories that might explain these things, right? But you really don't apply all the theory until the data is finished being collected. So data is gathered to elaborate emerging theory. So in qualitative research, the theory developed from the research can add a clearer understanding of a specific phenomena that is being studied in this way.